Greetings and welcome back to Building a New World, our peacekeeping and relations sector. This is session 2 for the evening, and it's my pleasure to introduce David Sloan Wilson. David Sloan Wilson is a SUNY Distinguished Professor of Biology and Anthropology at Binghamton University. He applies evolutionary theory to all aspects of humanity in addition to the rest of life, both in his own research and as director of EVOS, a unique campus-wide evolutionary studies program that recently received NSF funding to expand into a nationwide consortium. Among David's books, they include Darwin's Cathedral, Evolution, Religion, and the Nature of Society, Evolution for Everyone, How Darwin's Theory Can Change the Way We Think About Our Lives, Pro-Social, Using Evolutionary Science to Build Productive, Equitable, and Collaborative Groups, The Neighborhood Project, Using Evolution to Improve My City, One Block at a Time, and Does Altruism Exist? Culture, Genes, and the Welfare of Others. David is also president of Evolution Institute and editor-in-chief of This View of Life. So David, welcome to Building the New World.
Thank you so much. Thank you for organizing this venue. Okay, so, and welcome to everyone, whoever you are out there. Hope that you're weathering the pandemic. And I look forward to sharing some of this information with you. I think my slides are going to be up any minute now, and we can begin. Okay, great. Well, here I am with His Holiness the Dalai Lama. I was very honored to have a 1-hour conversation with him, sponsored by the Mind and Life Institute. And late October seems like a lifetime ago. And I was sharing with him what I'm going to be sharing with you for the most part. The content is much the same. So let's launch right into it. If I could have the next slide. First, a shout out to Barbara Marks Hubbard, who is being remembered as part of this series of events. What a wonderful woman! And as Deepak Chopra said, a voice for conscious evolution of our time. Next slide, please. And Barbara is part of a community of people who call themselves the evolutionary leaders. Over 100 of them, I believe, and I'm proud to count myself among them, all of them working towards evolving a better world. Next slide, please. We have a book out called Our Moment of Choice, Evolutionary Visions and Hope for the Future. Over 43 of us have written short essays that calls upon all of humanity to be united in purpose, of course, and that objective is the very same that brings us together today. So such amazing things happening. And yet, next slide, please. When you place that book and everything it represents on side by side with some other books on evolution, you get a big disconnect here. Why is it that the evolutionary leader's vision of evolving a better world is so at odds with this famous book by Richard Dawkins, now celebrating its 40th anniversary edition, sold in the millions of copies. What's going on here? Next slide, please. So Houston, we have a problem. There is a massive disconnect between the spiritual and activist community embracing the concept of evolution and the actual scientific study of evolution. I should know because I am trained as an evolutionary biologist, spent much of my career studying the all things great and small, a menagerie of other species in addition to our own species. And so I can testify that there is actually almost no overlap between my colleagues in evolutionary science and the evolutionary leaders. And so this is a very serious problem that we need to consider for ourselves. Next slide, please. So, and this is actually one of my main objectives for talking with His Holiness. If you look at the conscious evolution movement, what we find is that it's all about human, personal, and cultural change so profound that we call it transformation. It's about compassion, altruism, and prosociality in all of its forms. That's what we want to evolve. And we need to be conscious at how we go about doing it. Evolution and consciousness are almost always paired with each other in the conscious evolution movement. If you look at standard evolutionary science, what you find is that until very recently, it was confined to the study of genetic change, had little to say about human, personal, and cultural change. Dawkins wants you to know that everything that evolves is a kind of selfishness. Altruism, true altruism, is said not to exist. And evolution is emphatically not a conscious process. It's one of the strongest dogmas in the field of biological evolution, that variation is blind. Organisms vary without respect to what is selected, and the only selected is done by the environment. And as I told His Holiness at the beginning of our conversation, very little common ground between these two perspectives. But thankfully, things have changed in my field of evolutionary biology during the course of my 50 or 60 year career. So I'm happy to report in the next slide that we have something that's often called the extended evolutionary synthesis. And what it shows, it's basically expanded beyond genetic evolution to include all processes that include the three ingredients of variation, selection, and replication. That's what defines a Darwinian process. The extended evolutionary synthesis can explain the evolution of prosociality, all things we associate with goodness, in addition to selfishness. So such things as compassion and altruism can be explained at face value as a product of evolution. And it admits the possibility of conscious evolution, especially in the case of human, personal, and cultural evolution. What a sea change. What a sea change. And as my colleague and friend Kurt Johnson said long ago, actually when I first met him, is that this is like sailing with the wind rather than against it. So I have good news to report. I have good news. And happy to spend an hour with you reporting this very good news indeed. So next slide, please. So I actually see my role. I love being in the company of the evolutionary leaders. And I see my role as an evolutionary scientist is to integrate the movement with modern evolutionary science. I want to emphasize that this is not a one-way street. This is not the hard scientist coming to bring you the word, because in many respects, the so-called hard science is catching up with the vision of the evolutionary leaders. But that hard science still adds tremendous value to the enterprise. And so I think the conscious evolution movement can be made much, much stronger by being placed on a hard scientific foundation. In the first place, it gives us legitimacy. Wouldn't it be great to show that what we're driving towards has solid underpinnings in the scientific study of evolution? Number two, it provides an overarching cosmology. And I think part of the spiritual imagination, certainly part of the religious imagination, is to have some kind of framework that in some ways we feel it can explain everything. And for those of us that are interspiritual and that actually would prefer to have a secular cosmology than a religious cosmology, then being able to tell a story, a coherent narrative story that goes from the origin of life to the global superorganism is nothing can be more exciting than that. And at the same time, it provides a practical toolkit for actually getting down to work and consciously evolving our future. And that's a point I just can't stress enough. Next slide. This double benefit of adopting an evolutionary worldview. On the one hand, we get to ponder the biggest questions that philosophers and great thinkers have ever pondered concerning the origin of life, the nature of life, and the nature of the human condition. And at the same time, we get to actually solve these problems in our everyday lives, like a plumber or a carpenter with a conceptual toolkit. And I love the toolkit metaphor because it's so down to earth. It means basically we can show up at some job, we can size it up, we could pull out the tools, get the job done, and move on to the next job. Wouldn't it be great if we could actually do that for our lives at all scales, from our personal lives, especially to our small groups, where we work together to get things done, all the way up to the intermediate layers, our current institutions, our current organizations, and then finally the whole Earth. Wouldn't it be great if we had a practical toolkit to do all of that? And we do. And so we have both of these. And I think that put them together and they're an unbeatable combination. Okay, next slide, please. So my fellow travelers, a few of them, I have many of them actually, a whole community, but the three I'd like to single out are, in the first place, Kurt Johnson, who I've already mentioned. I think many of my listeners already know Kurt because he's so well known in the interspiritual community. I think he's the only other evolutionary leader who has a Ph.D. in evolutionary biology. He's a great friend and colleague. Jeff Janung is president of contemplativelife.org, which many of your listeners might well know. It is an internet hub for spiritual and contemplative practices. And Jeff is a core member of Pro-Social World. That's actually a new spin-off of the Evolution Institute that I'm going to be talking about. So I work with Jeff very closely, especially on a project called Pro-Social Spirituality, which I will be talking about. And then third, I want to mention another person very well known, I'll bet to all of my listeners, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who, like Kurt and myself, was a distinguished scientist in addition to a Jesuit priest who had one foot in each world and was amazingly ahead of his time. And so if you're familiar with the work of Teilhard, then you've got a real head start in understanding what's happening today. I sometimes actually call myself the current incarnation of Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. So next slide, please. Okay, so what I want to cover in our time together is to give you an introduction as best I can to this extended evolutionary synthesis, all the exciting things that have been happening in my field of evolutionary science, and then an introduction to the practical toolkit for evolving the future together. And the best outcome that I can ask for is your personal engagement moving forward. I'm passionate about the idea of learning to action. If this doesn't actually move you to cause you to do something that you would not have done otherwise, then I have not succeeded. And I've been working very hard with many colleagues to create a framework, a whole architecture, including an internet architecture and architecture in other senses for engaging people and evolving the future, basically, what we're all trying to do, but with all of the tools that I'm going to be talking about. So the best outcome is that you'll be inspired to work with me further and my colleagues and to join the community that we are trying to create. Well, let's start. So next slide. So here's the standard evolutionary science and the extended evolutionary synthesis side by side. And what I'll do is I will go through each of these three major points. How can we go from just the study of genetic change to studying all variation, selection, replication processes? How is it now that we can explain how all things that associated with goodness can evolve by a Darwinian process, can be accepted at face value? And how is it that we can go beyond one of the strongest dogmas in evolutionary biology, that evolution is not conscious, and have a robust concept of conscious evolution. This is what I'll try to cover in the very short time that we have available. Next. So when you go back to the beginning, Charles Darwin, what you discover is that he thought that his theory applied to all aspects of humanity in addition to the rest of life. What an amazing man. At the same time that he was studying barnacles and orchids and earthworms, he was studying morality and the expression of emotions. He was studying his own children. And so his vision of evolution was really what we're returning to. He knew nothing about genes. For him, evolution had three ingredients: variation, organisms vary in just about everything that could be measured; selection, some of those differences make a difference in terms of survival and reproduction; and replication, offspring resemble their parents, at least to a degree. That was his theory. And the replication part, he knew nothing about genes. But when genes were discovered, or rather rediscovered, because Mendel was a contemporary of Darwin, but the significance of his work was not appreciated until the early 20th century, as soon as genetics was born as a discipline, then the study of evolution quickly became confined to genetic evolution, as if the only way that offspring can resemble their parents is by sharing genes. That's something that's manifestly false when you put it that way, but that is essentially what the study of evolution became. The study of cultural and personal change was ceded to other disciplines, that what we call the social sciences and the behavioral sciences, and each of these disciplines developed into a sophisticated body of knowledge, but largely in isolation from evolutionary theory, also in isolation, largely in isolation from each other. And the result has been something that I call knowledge archipelago. I want to spend just a minute explaining what it means for there to be a knowledge archipelago. Next slide, please. This is a real archipelago. This is the Malay archipelago. This was the region of the world that was studied by Alfred Russel Wallace, the co-discoverer of the theory of natural selection. And an archipelago like this, with all of its isolated islands, is a hotspot of biological diversity. Why is that? It's because every island is its own universe. So the species evolved on those islands, and then they change on those islands in isolation from each other so that they gradually become different species. And so, when you try to intermate them, then they don't interbreed. They're genetically incompatible with each other. And I think that as part of taking cultural evolution seriously, we could ask the question, what does it mean for a scholarly discipline to be an island that does not communicate with other islands? What you find is the same kind of diversification, but this diversification is not necessarily a good thing because it leads to basically mutual incomprehension. The ideas that develop in one discipline or one school of thought, actually it's internally consistent, but it's incompatible, if only due to isolation from other schools of thought. The correspondence of speciation is mutual incomprehension, a Tower of Babel, you might say. This is a tremendous barrier to communication and integration that must be transcended. And I should say, in addition to a knowledge archipelago, there's actually a practice archipelago outside of academia. When you look at just, schools of practice, spiritual practice or therapeutic practice, what you find is that each one might have a degree of success, a degree of wisdom, but the same kind of incommensurability that needs to be transcended. We need to do something so we could unify these different islands of thought, make use of the best of them, but you have to have communication to do that. You have to have a common language. And in many respects, science, and especially evolutionary science, provides this common language for both consilience in knowledge and practice. And we will be returning to these themes. Next slide, please. Okay, so it wasn't until the closing decades of the 20th century that evolutionary scientists started to go back to basics by going back to those three ingredients, however they might occur: variation, selection, and replication by any mechanism. So that's including but going beyond genetic evolution. What are some of these other inheritance mechanisms? Next slide. Well, in addition to genetics, we have epigenetics, changes in gene expression, which has become a really hot topic. Do you know that you might resemble your parents not because you inherit different genes, the same genes, but the genes being turned on and off? For example, traumatic experiences in the parent can result in the upregulation of some genes, the downregulation of others, and those patterns of gene expression are transmitted to offspring. This is getting pretty Lamarckian, basically, that basically the way you are can be due to the experiences, not just of your parents, but even your grandparents and great-grandparents. So this is very exciting and new over the last 20 or 30 years. Then there's social learning found in many species. So you might resemble your parents or the older generation simply because you learned from them. And a special kind of learning is symbolic thought, which is distinctively human. We might be the only species that maintains a large inventory of symbols with shared meaning and pass that along. Now we're getting into real religious systems or meaning systems that are distinctively, perhaps even uniquely human. And all of those are transgenerational evolutionary processes. In addition, there's evolutionary processes that take place within every individual during the course of their lifetime. And the best known of these is the immune system. The immune system, most of you know, is said to include two components. There's an innate component, which does not change during the lifetime of the individual and is enormously complex. And then there's an adaptive component. That's the antibodies. So all of us right now have about 100 million different antibodies circulating in our veins. And each antibody is capable of latching on to a very narrow range of organic surfaces. And our immune system has a way of identifying the antibodies that latch on to antigens, disease agents, and then amplifying those antibodies. So there's your evolutionary process: variation, selection, and replication taking place within our lifetimes. And so that's interesting. But now let's think about our behavioral flexibility. It also has an open-ended component, so that basically trial and error learning, what B.F. Skinner called operant conditioning. To some extent, we behave every which way, and then we have instincts that cause us to ramp up the behaviors that are successful and to tamp down the behaviors that are unsuccessful. And so that's the sense in which each and every one is an open-ended evolutionary process. And there's also an innate component to psychology that doesn't change during the course of our lifetime. So the metaphorical comparison, or I should actually drop the word metaphorical, the comparison between our behavioral system and our immune system is a very, very powerful comparison. And the more we study this mechanistically, the more we find neuronal and developmental processes that are turning out to be Darwinian, going by names such as neural Darwinism or evolutionary development. These are actually physically variation, selection, and replication processes, again, like the immune system. And then finally, there's evolutionary algorithms on computers, such as artificial intelligence, neural networks, which have become so powerful. This is evolution taking place lightning fast in silico rather than in in vitro. So this is what it means to go beyond genetic evolution. All of these are Darwinian processes, and what we have learned for genetic evolution can be transferred to these other processes. Next slide, please. So part of this is called dual inheritance theory. What does that mean? Each of us is a collection of genes. That's called our genotype. And those genes, to some extent, influence the way we are, which can be measured. That's called our phenotype. Anything that can be measured is part of our phenotype. Yet each of us is also a collection of symbols, our symbiotype. Let's call it our symbiotype. That's a new word. That also influence our measurable properties. That same phenotype, anything that could be measured, is potentially influenced as much by our symbolic systems as by our genes. And so, therefore, our symbolic systems qualify as an inheritance system, no less than our genes, two streams of inheritance that co-evolved with each other. Genetic evolution actually gave rise to our capacity for symbolic thought, and ever since they've been co-evolving with each other. But in some ways, cultural evolution takes the lead because it's faster. And so the first thing that happens, I think that's actually the next slide. And here's an important book on that topic called Evolution in Four Dimensions, one of the key books that you could read to learn more about this. So when we interact in our lives, in our environments, the first thing we tend to do is adapt by individual learning. That's a very fast process. What we learn often gets transmitted. That's cultural evolution. That's also a fast process, although sometimes actually it could be quite slow. We might get back to that. And then that changes the selection pressures operating on our genes. One of the most famous examples is our ability to digest lactose as adults. Mammals, all mammals, only drink milk as infants. And in all mammals, the ability to digest lactose is turned off because adults don't need it. But in humans, some human populations, the ones that started to keep livestock, that was the cultural adaptation. Now milk became available as a resource for adults. And then over time, genetic evolution took place so that in those populations, then the ability to digest lactose as adults evolved by genetic evolution. So your ability to digest lactose depends on who your ancestors were and whether they came from dairying cultures. There's a big literature on that and many other examples of basically cultural evolution leading the way and genetic evolution being the following force. Next slide, please. Okay, so there's one tool in Darwin's a toolkit, and now I'm going to introduce another tool with the game of Monopoly. So you all know that game. You know what it's about. It's about getting all the real estate and driving everyone else bankrupt. So imagine playing the game of Monopoly. Get yourself in a Monopoly mood. And now I'm going to change the rules. Next slide. Now it's a Monopoly tournament. And there's many teams playing. And the trophy goes to the team that collectively develops its real estate the fastest. So think about playing a Monopoly tournament. I've actually done this with a science club, and it was so interesting to see the switch, basically. And I think you'll see, next slide, that nearly every decision you make as a team player will be different than playing the regular game of Monopoly. Isn't that interesting? So what does this show? Next slide. Evolution is like this. This is called multi-level selection. And when we think of natural selection at the smallest scale of individuals within a single social group, what we find is that it's much like the single game of Monopoly. Who's most fit within a single group is the one that captures most of the resources. And so the evolution that takes place in a single group will result in the kind of behaviors that we play when we play the single game of Monopoly, basically striving for ourselves and caring nothing about others. Others are your competitors. Others are to be beaten as far as the smallest scale of natural selection is concerned. But if we go up to a slightly larger scale, competition among groups, well, then natural selection is favoring teamwork. And there's a level of evolution that also exists. And so a very important message here is that teamwork does not come for free. It's not the case that evolution invariably results in cooperative groups. A certain process is required, namely between group selection. And that process is opposed by selection at a smaller scale. So this is profoundly different than the concept of the invisible hand in economics, which pretends that basically the unbridled pursuit of self-interest robustly benefits the common good, as if led by an invisible hand. Next slide. And we could actually stretch this out, this logic, which I explained with two levels, within group selection and between group selection, to a multi-tier hierarchy. So in plain English, what's good for me can be bad for my family. What's good for my family can be bad for my clan. What's good for my clan can be bad for my nation. What's good for my nation can be bad for the planet. Nations growing their economy can overheat the earth, for example. And we could even frame shift downward. What's good for my cells can be bad for the organism. That's what cancer is. Cancer is the process of natural selection taking place within ourselves as multicellular organisms. Cancer cells are playing the single game of Monopoly, and evolution has no foresight. If a cell evolves, if a mutation occurs that causes the cell to proliferate compared to neighboring cells, that's evolution. That will happen. It will increase in frequency. It doesn't matter that the cancer will ultimately kill the organism and therefore itself. Evolution has no foresight. So these are very, very sobering conclusions that we can draw about evolution. Evolution does not make everything nice. The general rule is that adaptations, functional organization, things working well at any level requires a process of selection at that level and tends to be undermined by selection at lower levels. I'm throwing a lot at you, but I think you can see actually that it's pretty intuitive, and I'll bet a lot of you get it because it's actually not hard, and it becomes just common sense with a little bit of practice. Next slide. So I just made this point. Evolution doesn't make everything nice. Frequently results in outcomes that benefit me but not you, individual selfishness, us but not them. Self-preservation is great until it leads to self-dealing. Helping family and friends is great until it leads to nepotism and cronyism. And also, evolution frequently results in benefiting ourselves over the short term, but without regard to the long term. And so we come to the conclusion that many pathologies, including personal pathologies and social pathologies, are actually adaptive in the evolutionary sense of the word. They're what resulted from the evolutionary process. And so if we want positive change, if we want to evolve things that are good for the whole world over the long term, we must manage the evolutionary process. We must do something so that evolutionary forces become aligned with our normative goals. If we don't do that, then evolution will still take place, but it will take us where we don't want to go. Next slide. There's also something called evolutionary mismatch. And in that top slide there, what we see is a male beetle trying to mate with a beer bottle, something that is manifestly bad for it. So what's going on This beetle, you might see actually, its wing covers, its elytra, are kind of dimpled in appearance. And so that's the cue that males use in searching out females. They fly around looking for dimpled surfaces. And in their ancestral environment, that would be female beetles. But this beer bottle happens to have a dimpled appearance along the bottom. And so this male has been fooled into thinking that the beer bottle is the sexiest female beetle it has ever seen. And there's nothing in its behavioral repertoire is going to change it. It has simply been fooled. So that is when evolutionary mismatch is when a change in the environment, a new environment, caused behaviors that were previously adaptive to misfire. And when you think about how much our species has altered our own environment, then we are awash in mismatches. In many ways, we are like that beetle. Obesity is just one part of that. And the fact that we've changed the face of the earth for every species means that we've generated mismatches for ourselves and the rest of life on Earth. And only a sophisticated knowledge of evolution can help us address so many of these mismatches. Next slide. Okay, so now this next concept called major evolutionary transitions follows directly from multi-level selection. So in many species are a mosaic of traits. Some evolved by within group selection, they're disruptive. Some evolved by between group selection, they're cooperative. But this balance between levels of selection is not static. It can itself evolve. And in rare cases, mechanisms evolve that suppress disruptive within group selection so that between group selection becomes the primary evolutionary force. And when this happens, the group becomes so cooperative in so many different ways that it actually becomes a higher level organism in its own right. Next slide. This idea was first proposed by Lynn Margulis, a cell biologist. She called it the symbiotic cell theory, and I'll bet that's familiar to at least some of our listeners. What she proposed and turned out to be true was that nucleated cells, which are more complicated than bacterial cells, did not evolve by small mutational steps from bacteria, but as symbiotic communities of bacteria that became so integrated that they became a higher level organism. Then we have multicellular organisms, we have eusocial insect colonies, all the way to the origin of life as probably groups of cooperating molecular reactions. Next slide. And so here we get this cosmology, basically, that I was talking about, this sweeping cosmology, everything from the origin of life to these other major transitions, and the human story falls into the same line. Human evolution is a major transition. If you look at our closest ancestors and most other primate species, including chimps, what you find is a little bit of cooperation, but a lot of conflict within groups. One book on this topic, a new book on this topic, is called The Goodness Paradox by Richard Wrangham. And Wrangham, who studies both chimps and small-scale human groups, says that violent conflict in chimp communities is 100 to 1,000 times more frequent than in small-scale human societies. Something like this you see every day. And even cooperation is typically in the context of small alliances competing against other alliances within the same group. And so what makes our species so different is that we evolved the ability to suppress disruptive self-serving behaviors within groups, causing between group selection to be the primary evolutionary force. And social control was essential. When we talk about altruism and compassion and so on, it cannot exist without social control. It's social control which makes social environments safe for altruistic and compassionate behaviors. This is another major point that I tried to discuss with His Holiness the Dalai Lama with our conversation. The idea that you can try to make everyone compassionate and then the world will be better on the basis of that? No, that's necessary but not sufficient. We also must have the means in order to prevent bad actors, basically, from having the advantage. So in any case, thanks to this major transition, this ability to suppress disruptive self-serving behaviors within groups, just like the previous major transitions, then teamwork became the signature adaptation of our species, represented here by this circle of children. I just love the image of the circle that they've made with their feet. You could never imagine chimps doing anything like that. Next slide, please. So teamwork has physical form, physical activities. The familiar hunting, gathering, childcare was huge. And Sarah Hardy's Mothers and Others is a wonderful book to read on this topic. Predator defection, offense and defense against other human groups. Make no mistake, the fact that you're cooperative within a group says little about how you behave towards other groups. Between group interactions need not be violent, but often it was. And so warfare between groups and cooperation within groups have been joined at the hip throughout human history. That's actually the goodness paradox in the title of Richard Wrangham's book. In addition, next slide, teamwork took mental forms. And this is so interesting when you think, so we're brainwashed, you might say, enculturated to think of the mind as something which is an individual thing. We have a brain, that's our mind. And yet, what's turning out is that since we have always lived in small groups, we never, ever lived alone in our entire evolutionary history, always in the context of small groups. Then actually, there's a very strong sense in which the group has a mind, of which the individual plays a part. This goes with perception, memory. We don't remember as individuals a small fraction of what we need to. If it weren't for information stored in other heads, or more recently externally, well, we couldn't be the species that we are. Decision-making was almost always a group affair. And then we have language and other forms of symbolic thought, as I've already discussed. Everything associated with the arts, starting with laughing, which preceded language, by the way, are mechanisms for forming groups and coordinating among groups. And then the transmission of learned information across generations absolutely requires cooperation and teamwork. And so without teamwork, we couldn't have the capacity for cultural evolution that we do. And that's precisely why we are so distinctive as a species. It's why our closest relatives don't have symbolic systems, because members of groups don't trust each other enough to develop such a things. Shockingly, chimps don't even know what it means to point. Something as simple as I point something out that might be relevant to your interests is something that chimps don't do and don't understand, as smart as they are in other respects. And so this is so interesting. This is part of the extended evolutionary synthesis that is so amazingly different than standard evolutionary theory. Next slide. And then cultural evolution is multi-level, just as much as genetic evolution. And so during the last 10,000 years, we have a positive feedback cycle between the production of resources, agriculture. So now societies became larger, and the scale of human society is a multi-level process. So actually, there's a whole story. It's called a Z-shaped curve, that our primate relatives were despotic, not egalitarian. Small-scale societies, human societies, highly egalitarian. With the advent of agriculture, the scale of society actually outstripped our ability to be egalitarian. That was a return to despotic society for a period of human history. But thankfully, between group selection, cultural evolution resulted in relatively cooperative egalitarian societies, replacing those despotic societies, never entirely, and with many reversals along the way. And religions played a very important role. The so-called axial age religions, all of the major religious tradition arose during a certain period historians call the axial age. And what they did was they provided a social glue that held society together at a larger scale so that tens of millions of people now could consider themselves within the same society. And so we can credit religion with that, but always in the context of warfare at an even larger scale. The goodness paradox, even for the major religious traditions, including Buddhism. Before I had my conversation with His Holiness, I did a lot of reading, including the history of Tibet. And Buddhism in Tibet, over its 2,500-year history, took place in the context of incessant warfare at various scales. A feudal society is the context in which Tibetan Buddhism evolved. And for all of its magnificence, it never questioned the axioms of feudal society. So it is so very interesting to think of all of these traditions, religious and spiritual traditions, in the context of human cultural evolution. Next slide. And so there can be no grander narrative than this, starting with the origin of life, going all the way up to the origin of our species, the increase in scale in human societies. And then there's that final rung. If you see where we are today, what we find is that societies at a scale, cooperative societies at a scale that would have been unimaginable to our ancestors. We might wish they functioned better, but the best of them function very well indeed. And so a scale of cooperation that would be unimaginable in the past, and yet we need to go higher. There's a final rung of global cooperation. And from this long view, it seems as if we have just one more step to go. If we're already functioning in societies of millions and even over 1 billion, then that final rung, if we know how to do it, is within reach. Next slide, please. Okay, so finally, beyond blind evolution, this dogma that evolution has no purpose arose in the context of genetic evolution. By now, evolution was really just about Mendelian genetics. And there it emerged, at least based on knowledge at the time, that mutations are random with respect to what's being selected, and only the environment does the selecting. And so it's very, very important at the time to establish that fact and to actually get rid of a lot of fuzzy thinking about the nature of inheritance. But outside this limited context, the concept of guided evolution is perfectly legitimate, especially in the case of human cultural evolution. So here's some examples of guided evolution. Next slide. There's something called the Baldwin effect that's been known actually since the early 20th century, which is back to the idea that fast-paced evolutionary processes such as learning and cultural evolution guide genetic evolution. So blind evolution results in unblind organisms that make guided decisions, and then those guided decisions feed back on the evolutionary process. This is a kind of Lamarckism, a kind of guided evolution, which is perfectly consistent with blind genetic evolution. Then there's the phenomenon of artificial selection, where humans are the selective force. So when we select the traits of our domesticated plants and animals, we do so consciously to a very large degree, and that does not stop it from being an evolutionary process. And the idea of self-domestication, that what we've been doing to each other, basically selecting each other for docility, in the same way that we select our farm animals for docility, is a very, very hot topic now. Just type self-domestication into Google or Google Scholar, and you'll find books and articles on that topic. We could ask me more about that in the Q&A, and I'll tell you a little bit more about it. And then, of course, there's evolutionary computer algorithms. When we make an algorithm that selects for something, and then we program in variation, selection, and replication, well, the whole thing is consciously designed from start to finish, and yet it's still an evolutionary process. And so the idea of conscious evolution, perfectly acceptable in these contexts. Next slide. So when we talk about conscious evolution in humans, however, we really have to be recognized that this is a glass only part full. Yes, there's a conscious component, but there is still a huge unintended component to human cultural evolution. To a very large degree, cultural evolution takes the form of many unintended social experiments, only a few that hang together. And so what that means is that results in cultures that work without having been designed by anyone. And we take part in these cultures without knowing how they work. We have no more knowledge of how our cultures work than how our genes work in many cases. And even our intentional efforts result in unforeseen consequences. What you find is we're all striving at some level, that's intended, but then those intentions collide with each other, resulting in outcomes which then become fodder for a blind process of cultural evolution. And so it's hard to know which is more impressive, the conscious component of evolution or the unconscious component. But one thing's for sure, if evolution is going to become the solution rather than the problem, then evolution has to be more conscious than ever before. This is what it means to basically steer the evolutionary process and to be more mindful about it than ever before. That's really the task of conscious evolution and the evolutionary leaders. Next slide. Okay, well, I find myself with 9 minutes to go if I'm going to honor the Q&A. And getting to the toolkit part, which is the most interesting part. So I might actually, with your permission, steal just a little bit of time from the Q&A to get to the end of my presentation, but I'll go as fast as I can. 3 points I want to get across. Let's just go right into it. Next slide. So happy to introduce you to Elinor Ostrom. Every time I give a talk, I ask my audience who all knows about her. And typically I get a smattering of hands. Everyone should know about her. She was a political scientist, and she won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2009, even though she wasn't an economist and was unknown among economists. And what she studied was the famous tragedy of the commons. I bet you are familiar with that. That's the tendency of people drawing upon a common pool resource to take more than their share, such as if there's a common pasture, then the farmers add more cows than can be sustained by the pasture because they get more than their share. And conventional wisdom was that the tragedy of commons can only be avoided by privatizing the commons, which isn't always possible, or by regulating it from the outside, top-down regulation. And so Lynn's great achievement was to actually, by studying common pool resource groups around the world, groups trying to manage common pool resources around the world, she showed that some, not all, but some, were actually capable of managing their natural resources on their own, but only if they implemented certain core design principles. And it's these principles that won her the Nobel Prize. And I'm very pleased to introduce you to these principles, if you're not already. And when I do, I want you to think about a group that's important in your life, okay? Think about any group in your life that you partake in, which is important to you, and then see if these core design principles might be important for your group. Also see to what extent does your group actually implement these core design principles. So here we go. Next slide, please. Okay, the first and most important is that a group needs a strong sense of identity and purpose. So you need to know that you're in a group, that the group is important for you, who's in the group, what the group is about. In the case of a natural resource, what's the boundary of the group, who can use it, so on and so forth. If you don't have that, your group is unlikely to work well. Number two, fair distribution of costs and benefits. They're not sustainable for some members of the group to get the benefits and others to sustain the cost. There must be some sense in what you get out of the group is proportionate to what you give to the group. Number three, decision-making should be fair and inclusive, not sustainable for some members of the group to make the decisions without considering other members of the group. There's two problems with that. One is that it's a recipe for unfairness. The other is it does not make use of the wisdom of everyone in the group. Number 4, monitoring agreed upon behaviors. If we don't know that we're doing what we're supposed to do, then all bets are off. Number 5, graduated sanctions for misbehaviors. If you misbehave, something needs to be done about it, but it need not start out harsh. A friendly reminder is typically enough, and yet it must be possible to escalate in those cases where it's necessary. And we should be rewarding each other for our good behaviors in addition to punishing each other for our bad behaviors. Number 6, fast and fair conflict resolution. Conflicts will occur and they need to be resolved quickly in a manner that's regarded as fair by all parties. Most people in a dispute think that they have a point of view, and that needs to be respected. Number 7, authority to self-govern. If members of a group don't have elbow room to govern their own affairs, then of course they can't. And number 8, appropriate relations with other groups, which reflect the same core design principles. And this is so important because it means the very same principles apply at all scales. They're needed to govern relations between groups in addition to relations within groups. So there they are. How did your group do? And let's go to the next slide. I think you can see, even on the basis of this short talk, how these core design principles map onto multi-level selection. If you imagine a group where these core design principles are strongly implemented, and then imagine a member wanting to play the single game of Monopoly, it will not go well for that individual. This group is strongly protected from that kind of disruptive behavior. You might say that this group has undergone a miniature major transition as far as its cultural evolution is concerned. If you imagine a group that fails to implement these core design principles, then that's going to be easy pickings for somebody who wants to play the single game of Monopoly. And so it's that simple. So this leads to a bold prediction. Next slide. Once we generalize these core design principles, and I was honored to work with Elinor Ostrom for 3 years prior to her death, and so we generalized the core design principles from an evolutionary perspective. And when we see it, this is actually part of what I mean with the knowledge archipelago. We took something which originated in a certain field, political science, was unknown beyond that field, and then we reworked it so that it could be applied to any group of any kind, anywhere in the world. That's our bold prediction, that what Ostrom showed for one type of group should hold for all types of groups. No matter what type of group we study, we should find that they vary in how well they work, and that the best of them work well because they implement these core design principles. Why are they so fundamental? Because they're required for cooperation in all of their forms. And if there's one thing that groups share in common, it's the need for their members to cooperate. It's that simple. And we have data to show this. So the next slide is from an actual scientific study, which on the x-axis shows how well does your group implement the core design principles. And number 2, how well does your group function as a group? And we show a great fit. Okay, so there's our fit. The blue dots there are business groups, workplace groups. And the red dots are any other kind of group. So one purpose of this paper was not only to establish this correlation for many kinds of groups, but also to compare business groups with other kinds of groups. And what we see here is they all fall along the same line. So business groups need the same core design principles as any other kind of groups. Why not? Cooperation is needed in business groups just as much. And yet, although you see some blue dots up there at the top of the line, when you get down to the dysfunctional end, the groups that work poorly, because they don't implement the core design principles, you see a preponderance of business groups. And the next slide drills down on that point. And what we see is that the business groups, on average, are deficient in all 8 of the core design principles. First and foremost, the seventh one, autonomy to self-govern. In other words, many people in their workplaces can't do their jobs as they see fit. Then the second biggest deficit is decision-making. Many people in their jobs don't take part in the decisions that affect their work. And number three is identity and purpose. Many people in their jobs don't think that their jobs are meaningful, doing something meaningful. And so there's tremendous room for improvement in almost all groups. Unless your group is up at the top of that line, then you can improve. And business groups need that advice more than most. Next slide. Here, I just want to show you one more piece of data from a very recent study that we're just writing up, in which we were working with a large lecture class, and they were broken up into teams. They had to do posters together. That was a big class assignment. And one treatment, teams chosen at random, were coached just a little bit in the core design principles when they were writing their group contracts, their team contracts. And the other control treatment, they had to write a contract, but they were not coached in the core design principles. And this coaching was very brief, only a few minutes. They were given a little sheet. So this was a very, very light intervention. And then when you look at the difference between those two groups, what you find is on 20 different measures, you find that in each and every case, the experimental treatment group did better than the control group. So this is really proof, not just correlations, but proof that implementing the core design principles can help groups function better. So I've given you some very useful information in this talk. Next slide. Okay, so the take-home message here is that every group in your life can benefit from learning about and implementing the core design principles required for effective cooperation and coordination. You can learn about them on your own, especially our book Pro-Social does that. Even better, you could work with Pro-Social World, which is the framework that we've established to work with groups of all kinds. Now, I really do need to finish up, and so there's a little block of this talk that I'm going to pass through, and so please, Stephen, go forward until you get to the slide that says pro-social spirituality. Great stuff. I'm not getting to. Why did I think this would only take an hour? There we go. There we go. This is one of our newest projects. It's funded by the Templeton Religion Trust. It's with Jeff Janung, who I introduced earlier. And what it does is it examines spirituality. Are there core spiritual principles in addition to core design principles? Is there some sense in which a group can benefit not just by implementing the core design principles, but also becoming more spiritual? And so one way to think about this, next slide, is with the distinction between vertical and horizontal dimensions of religion. In the scholarly literature on religions, it is said that enduring religions are strong in two dimensions. One dimension is your relationship with the divine or the sacred. What's your relationship to God? Or your other sense of the divine, which need not be religious. You can think the earth is sacred, for example. But in any case, a strong attachment to something regarded as divine or sacred is the vertical dimension. And the horizontal dimension is one's relationship with other people with whom you work, within the faith and from other faiths. And so a strong meaning system of all sorts, actually, very likely needs to be strong in both dimensions. And the core design principles that I just introduced you to can be said as building a strong horizontal dimension. And so the question is, can we work on creating a strong vertical dimension? And so what we've done, next slide, is we've drawn upon the work of Brother Wayne Teasdale, who was a mentor of Jeff Janung, and who was the author of many books, including The Mystic Heart, also a good friend of His Holiness, the Dalai Lama. And in his book, Brother Wayne articulated 9 what he called universal spiritual elements, which are listed here. And because time is short, I won't go through them in detail, but what we're doing, next slide, is actually developing a training program for working with groups that includes both the CDPs and the universal spiritual elements. And we've designed this as a basic scientific research program in addition to a practical change method. So here again, there's opportunities for involvement, especially if you work with groups. If you're involved with groups in any capacity, then and want to get involved in this, then we've worked very hard in order to engage you in a expanding worldwide community. So next slide. Okay, I am at the end. And so I began this talk by pointing out that the conscious evolution movement is at odds in some respects with the traditional view of evolution. And that what I've tried to show you in this talk, next slide, is that the extended evolutionary synthesis changes all of that. It's like sailing with the wind rather than against the wind. Here's my newest book, This View of Life, which is an extended version of this and begins and ends with Teilhard de Chardin, by the way. And so isn't this great news? And yes, after you get used to it, even a child can understand it. So thank you very much. And thanks to the organizers for allowing me to speak with you. And now I think that we could have a great time with a Q&A.
Thank you so much, David. We really appreciate it. One of the things I noticed is that when we talk about conscious evolution, it's like the science is catching up, right? So if evolution is conscious, it knows what it's doing, and then the science is coming to prove it once we've realized that that needs to happen for whatever reason.
To a large extent. I mean, I can, yeah, I'll say yes to that. And at the same time, I think when we really have consilience, if we look at, I mean, with the interspiritual movement, of course, because it's integrating so many different traditions, then there's a kind of a science non-science divide, and so for me, it's very important that our meaning systems remain within the bounds of scientific knowledge. In other words, to put it bluntly, the woo-woo factor is something that I try to get as low as possible. And I don't mean disrespect for that, but I think that conversation does need to take place. The idea that our meaning system should be so motivating and at the same time very, very respectful of science. We've seen the toxic effects of science denial. I mean, science denial is something that really we cannot afford in this day and age. And so it's really new, historically new, that our meaning systems have to be more respectful of science than ever before. And in some ways that's a handicap, because why does counterfactual beliefs under any meaning systems, not just religious belief systems, is because they're motivating. They're so very motivating. They're not there for no reason, but at the same time, there's this cost. So I'm kind of launching off on another direction, but I think that this dialogue, I think at the same time that I want to say that that the hard science is catching up to the vision of the spiritual of the conscious evolution folks. I think the conscious evolution folks have to become very mindful and of the way they frame things, and do a little bit of pruning to stick within the bounds of what's known scientifically. Yeah. So there's a major point that I've introduced on the basis of your question.
Yeah. Thank you for the wisdom. Let's move into the Q&A then. The first question is up on the screen there. Do you think humanity is learning the lesson of group evolution and the power of cooperation over competition?
Slowly it is, yes. I think. We're coming off of a long period, 70 years of individualism, which has made the individual the fundamental unit and competition just the primary mode. And that's just not evolution. That's just not like social Darwinism, nature red in tooth and claw. The whole economic establishment has done this in its own way. And so, yes, and there's a whole spate of books on this topic. There's Humankind by Rutger Bregman, beautiful book. The Survival of the Friendliest by Brian Hare and Vanessa Woods. So yes, we're beginning to see basically the power of cooperation and be able to explain it scientifically. And I think that's one reason why the extended evolutionary synthesis is so important. At the very beginning of my book, This View of Life, I quote Einstein by saying, the theory decides what you can see. The theory decides what you can see. The narrative is important. And so a narrative that says greed is good, that's what you'll do. It's what you'll see. A narrative that says cooperation is good and is authentic about it is going to cause you to see the world through that lens. But you can't just implant the story, because this is another very, very important point, is that whether cooperation is good, altruism, compassion, all those great things, whether that good is very context specific. If you take the compassionate individual and put them in the company of other compassionate individuals, the result is spectacular. But if you take that same individual and put that individual in the company of non-compassionate individuals, well, they just become prey. They just become prey. You wouldn't want to do that to anyone. And so it's not enough to just say in some general context, independent fashion, you need to be more compassionate. We need to be smarter than that. Not only do we need to get people to adopt the compassionate strategy, but we need to create the social environment. That's where the core design principles come in, so that then they will win the Darwinian contest. And if you don't do that, you're setting up the compassionate individual for failure. That's unethical. So the way I put this to His Holiness is, we need to transform our inner lives, and we need to transform our outer lives. And working on our social environment, I think, is a shortcoming of the mindfulness-based movement. There's so much is on transformation of the inner life that it needs to pay equal attention. And I think the Mind and Life Institute agrees with this and is going in that direction. We need to work on the horizontal dimension in addition to the vertical dimension.
Yeah, absolutely. Next question then is, do you believe that social control / influence by quote unquote elders has been lost? Seems to have worked with small clusters of humans, but what can replace it in larger civilizations?
Right, that's a great question. And one point to make about that, which I didn't make in my talks as much as I want to, is the importance of interacting in small groups. That's the natural human social environment, and it needs to remain a cell in multicellular human, large-scale human societies. If we got everyone interacting in small groups, and those small groups were appropriately structured, then that would just work wonders all by itself. Individuals would thrive for individual well-being, and those cells would be much more efficacious at a larger scale than when individuals try to do things on their own. Now, when you say elders, then I want to amend that a little bit and say anyone who's cultivated a good reputation, because there's a difference there's two kinds of power. One is the power of dominance, just raw force, where I do what I want because I can. And the other is the kind of power that is bestowed on somebody because they are working for the good of the group. That might be because they're wise. It might be because they have some special talent, but it's for the good of the group, and therefore they have a high reputation. Social benefits flow to them. That's what it means. That's CDP2, proportional costs and benefits. If you're a respected leader of a group, it's because that's how much you're doing for the group. But as to who earns that reputation, I think that age is only part of that. And often, we look to the younger generation. And so I think that we don't want to be ageist, basically, about who ends up getting respect. And of course, in many cases, it is the elders that have the wisdom, they have the experience. After all, they've lived that long. But mostly, it is those that are contributing the most to the groups. And in many ways, I think one of the things I want to do with ProSocial is a youth corps, where a lot of the imagination and the energy comes from. So next one.
Yes. So the next question is, do you agree with Rian Eisler that partnerism is returning as a model of decision making?
Yes. I think that I know Rian Eisler's work. I love it. We want to partner with the queen of partnerism. And David Corton also, your two keynote speakers. Wonderful work. So these people are very much in the ballpark. And so I can only praise their work. Although one thing I'd like to add to that is the need to, it's kind of back to the archipelago metaphor. And this is especially true with the audience that I'm speaking with Kurt Johnson, for example, and Jeff. The whole world of spiritual thinkers and seekers that are kind of driving in the same direction. I sometimes think it's like a star map where you see all these galaxies, and each galaxy is a dense cluster of stars, but then there's enormous space between galaxies. And whenever I hear of someone or some organization who's doing this kind of work, I ask them, have you heard of so-and-so? And more often than not, the answer is no. And so there's this galaxy problem, archipelago problem, where there's so many people and organizations that are driving in the same direction, but they have different origins. Often they're centered on a given person, a charismatic figure. They have their own vocabulary. And so what that means is that they do great work, but they're unknown beyond their borders. And so there's a level of communication and cooperation which does not exist. And that needs to be overcome. And so it's there where we take great people and the organizations that they've built, and we need to join them up.
Yeah.
And how to do that, I mean, everyone will say yes to that, but how to do it, I think, is a challenge and requires, among other things, this common language so that we can actually understand what works in some way that's intertranslatable. And that's where I think the science comes in, as we did with the core design principles, emerged in one context, and then we were able to show, look, this is something that we all need. And let's study it scientifically. Let's actually show that what we're doing works. And then we can share it and communicate and so on.
Yeah. And I know, I mean, just to your point, I know in working with Barbara Marx Hubbard, that was like one of the things that she felt like she didn't get to see was all of the groups doing great things, and the challenge of coming together.
Yeah. And so our next question is, how important are intentional communities in modeling the future of group evolution? Great question. One of my former Ph.D. students who works with ProSocial, named Ian McDonald, did his Ph.D. thesis on intentional communities. And we worked with the Fellowship of Intentional Communities, FIC, in order to work with over 100 intentional communities. And we gave a very large survey. We did site visits. I went to Dancing Rabbit, which is a eco-village in Missouri, a famous intentional community. And what that survey showed was that on average, intentional communities do very well with respect to the core design principles. People join them because they want a sense of community. And to a large extent, they get what they wanted, and their quality of life is very high. And of course, there's variation, lots of variation. There always is, but the mean value is quite high. We're also starting to work with the transition network, transition town network. So I think intentional communities are awesome laboratories for doing this. We want to work with intentional communities because their scale is just right. The idea that we want to be in small groups, well, of course, that's what they get. That's what they get right. And yet they're not going to just converge on the core design principles on their own. That's a bit of a paradox, that on one hand, we're kind of genetically adapted to live in small groups. But on the other hand, it is emphatically not the case that every small group automatically adopts those core design principles. What you always get is a bell-shaped curve from the best to the worst. The mean value of that curve is someplace. But every group, actually every group, even the ones at the top, can benefit from an explicit understanding of the core design principle, plus adaptability tools that I didn't get to. The missing piece of this lecture were tools to make you more flexible, more adaptable, because often, even when we decide we want to move in a valued direction, we can't do it. We're stuck as individuals and as groups. And so the missing piece of my talk were tools that are very effective at increasing flexibility, our ability to work around obstacles to reach our valued goals.
And if people want to find out more about those tools, is there somewhere we could point them?
Oh yeah, well, Pro-Social World. I mean, this whole talk is an infomercial for Pro-Social World and Pro-Social, the book. There's lots of material on this that we're trying to get out there. And if worst comes to worst, email me. I'll send you the material.
And is it prosocialworld.org or com? What would be the website?
It's actually prosocial.world. www.prosocial.world.
We'll get that we'll put that up on the screen before we end.
That's great.
And then the next question is a spiral dynamics question. It appears that the spiral is collapsing, but is this a temporary setback in your opinion?
Yeah, there's so much to say about that. And so I'm familiar with spiral dynamics and Ken Wilber. I have a number of interviews with Ken that are accessible, and including a long conversation about my new book. And I love aspects of that work, and yet I think it needs to be critiqued in some respects. And I think that in terms of the cosmology, there's a kind of a stage theory that almost stages of humanity that is a little bit different than the one that I presented. And so when you think of this as like stages of development, and of course we want to advance to the higher stages, then if we go back, of course, then that's a setback. And this multi-level view that I have presented, I think, is actually an improved version of that stage theory. So when we say, what does it mean that we're going back? It means that cooperation at a large scale is falling apart, and that the social units that we identify with are now smaller, and they're in opposition to each other. There's so some sense in which selection at a high level has fallen apart, and that is indeed a setback. Basically, that is a collapse, and we could collapse further. But the solution to that problem is, of course, to re-engineer our social environment to build up that higher scale of cooperation. And I think that basically, to see it that way, provides more know-how about how to do it, more know-how than when we just posit stages, which makes it a little bit mysterious as to why we go back or how we move forward. That's like Kohlberg's stages of moral development in individuals. You know, it goes from 1 to 5. 5 is like the most enlightened, but why is it that whole populations are stuck at 3? I mean, where's the knowledge there? So it's kind of descriptive and typological, whereas here we have a much more dynamic view of all of these things are adaptive strategies, basically, that are succeeding or failing, that are in some kind of Darwinian competition, and that which is causing some to succeed and some to fail. And so unless we actually work on the social environment to alter that landscape, then we'll get evolution taking us where we don't want to go. And of course, that's happening big time right now.
Yeah. And would you say, just to dovetail or to follow up on that question, then, would you say that evolution, let's say the worst case of those breakdowns, that evolution knows actually how to quote unquote fix it, and then people would come to conclude that cooperation is actually the generative way to get back on track with?
Well, we can be quite specific. We can say, for example, the most important message of multi-level selection is that cooperation at a given scale requires selection at the same scale, and that lower level selection, it creates cooperative units, but those cooperative units interfere with each other, and so that creates dysfunction and discord higher up the scale. When you absorb the meaning of that, what it means is we must have a whole earth ethic. We must be planning with the welfare of the whole earth in mind. Now, this whole audience probably already has a whole earth ethic, but now you have a much stronger reason for prosecuting it and for explaining why it is essential for us to have a whole earth ethic. And yet, that doesn't mean that the lower levels become irrelevant. Quite the contrary, because it's our small groups that are most meaningful for us. If you just have the whole earth in mind, you can't sustain that. But you need to live in as a small group that's dedicated to that and is reinforcing each other at that scale. And then all the intermediate levels, all the levels of governance that already exist, all the religions and secular institutions that already exist have to fall into line with that, so that we have this multi-level structure oriented towards the global good. So that's a pretty darn specific prescription. It's what Elinor Ostrom called polycentric governance, and it can be generalized from an evolutionary perspective. So the blueprint that we have to do this is, I think, filled in to a higher degree, which isn't to say that we know what to do. In fact, another part of this is that we emphatically don't know what to do. All of this is so complex that the best that we can do is to try things out to the best of our knowledge. But then we have to monitor that, because there'll surely be unintended consequences. And then we have to revise. And so the feedback between what we try to do, assessing whether it works, back to the drawing board, a new round of things, that's what evolution is, a rapid variation and selection process. So what we're doing is we're creating an evolutionary process, a process of cultural evolution, and we're managing it so that we're selecting for the traits that basically benefit the common good. But the machinery, the architecture that's needed for that is extensive. That's where you need the internet, technology, and all of those things have to be brought to bear upon it.
Yeah. As we one more question here, and then I'll have one more that I want to ask after this one, and then that'll wrap us up. So, have you ever seen the movie Idiocracy? And could that happen?
The answer is no. So we will get to the next question very fast. I look forward to viewing it.
Yeah, put that on your watch list. Okay, so I just wanted to circle back, because you brought up during the presentation that a question didn't come up on this, but you said that you might have some more color to add around self-domestication. So anything else you want to say about that?
Well, it turns out that when you select for docile behavior in any animal, a whole bunch of other stuff comes along with it, because docile behavior is something which is connected to many other traits, including anatomical traits and physical traits and so on. And there's a famous experiment that was done on foxes in Russia, silver foxes that were being bred for their coats, but they weren't tame at all. And they bred for tameness. And what they got was something very dog-like, floppy ears, spotted coats, curly tails, shorter snouts. And so this, an important lesson here is traits are stuck together. Not every trait evolves independently of other traits. And so there's a whole domestication syndrome. And because it's anatomical, it leaves a signature in the fossil record. And so such things as skull dimensions and things like that. And so it's on that basis that we can say with, it's looking pretty compelling that what happened in human evolution was a form of self-domestication. Basically, and this gets back to social control. So in a group where there's enough social control, that means if somebody tries to be a bully, it doesn't work well for them. And ultimately, they're executed. So capital punishment, strangely enough, is an important part of the human evolutionary story. This is another point that Richard Wrangham makes. If somebody just can't behave, and bear in mind, you're out there in the wilderness, there's no police, there's no centralized society, none of any kind. There's just a big bully that's just can't control themselves. What are you going to do? So you can exclude them, but it might just come to that. But whatever model reforms, what that meant is that people were selecting out the most aggressive individuals, and that's what self-domestication is. The friendly, compatible, cooperative individual actually ended up winning the Darwinian contest, and all those other traits went with it. That whole domestication syndrome went with it. And so this enables us to actually turn it not just into a speculative just so story, but we actually have pretty compelling evidence that what we did to each other is the same thing that we did to our farm animals. And that's just cool, isn't it?
Mm. Now, do you mind going with us a few more minutes? I've been told
as long as you want.
Questions still rolling in, so we'll go a little bit over if that's okay. So the next question is there an assessment tool to test whether a group is adhering to the core design principles? Yes,
if you work with us, then that's exactly what we'll do. We'll give your group a survey to assess the core. That's exactly what we'll do, and then we could work on them. And we'll also use this flexibility tool, so that you'll be able to you'll be flexible enough to improve in addition to knowing what to do. Basically, the core design principles will be your target of selection, and then the flexibility tool will help you work towards that target. This idea of flexibility, by the way, let me say just a minute more about it. It's a trait that can be measured very easily. Not hard to measure how flexible you are in how you interact with your environment. People vary. There's a bell-shaped curve. And if you look at that variation before you do any kind of intervention, you look at that variation, what you find is that although everyone experiences adversity, harsh environments now and then, if you're inflexible, that will impact your mental health. If you're flexible, it will impact your mental health much less. So flexibility moderates your response to stress. So that's important. You want to be flexible. Now, the second point is that it can be trained. It's not just a trait that you have and are born with and you can't change. No, it can be changed. You can become more flexible. And the entire success of therapy, especially mindfulness-based therapy, and especially a form called acceptance and commitment therapy, founded by Steve Hayes, with whom we work, that's how it works. It makes you more flexible at achieving your valued goals and not getting stuck in various traps that hook you, and which are actually adaptive in the evolutionary sense of the word, but in a way that creates problems, not solutions.
Thank you. Our next question is, how would you rate/evaluate our current society in the US using the core principle yardstick? It doesn't look good from here vis-a-vis the collaboration you highlight.
Right, and the point I make there is that because these principles are scale independent, you can evaluate the larger social units, such as nations. And when you do that, and there's books on this topic, like The Spirit Level and Why Nations Fail, and these are political science books that they actually do a great job at measuring how well nations are succeeding as corporate units. And in those scales, that data shows a lot of variation. Some nations work super well, others work super poorly. At the top end of the distribution, we get the Nordic countries always: Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, also the Netherlands, Switzerland, Japan does pretty well, Germany does pretty well. And on the end that doesn't work well, there is, there's actually a hodgepodge there, but among the development nations, the United States does very poorly, basically. So the United States just does not work well for its citizens for reasons that we know. We all live here. And so there's point one. Do you know that you can take the United States and you can unpack it, and you can do the same study of the 50 states within the United States, and the same curve emerges? The states vary in their implementation of the core design principles and how well these function. So this is truly fractal. Same principles are operating in the smallest of groups and the largest of now, do you know that this alters within nations? And so you could look at the history of the United States, and you can show that it has fluctuated. It looks like a roller coaster. And there's a book by Peter Turchin on this topic called Ages of Discord, that if you were to visit the United States in the 1830s, which is when Tocqueville did, you would find that it scored exceptionally well. That was the time, historians call that the era of good feelings. But then that slid into the Gilded Age with extreme inequality, in which it was the worst of times. And then we pulled out of that, and there was the New Deal, which was not good for everyone, because throughout this period, there were some groups, such as African Americans, that never got any kind of a good deal. We always have to acknowledge that. But in any case, there was much more equity during that period, and now we've slid into the second Gilded Age. We'll have to see if we pull out of it again. And so the same principles are explaining small groups, nations, and not just comparisons between nations, but every nation's history are being explained by the same set of principles. What amazing explanatory scope.
Oh, yeah, fascinating. I know this, you already answered this next question about which country in the world exemplifies the highest expression of the core principles. I know you were saying Nordic countries, Germany.
Well, yeah, if you want more on that, then go to I'll speak it slowly. My online magazine, This View of Life, there is a series of conversations titled Evolution, Complexity, and the Third Way of Entrepreneurship. Evolution, Complexity, and the Third Way of Entrepreneurship. And part of that series of conversations is a conversation about Norway. And so if you want to drill down, then that whole series will fascinate you. But the one on Norway, that's the best way to kind of learn about the Nordic countries from this perspective.
Yeah, thank you. So the next question is, do you think it's possible for any sort of evolution, conscious or otherwise, to keep pace with advances in technology and the changes in our physical environment?
Yes, I do. And of course, evolution, I mean, change is evolution. When we say that things are changing rapidly, that's just cultural evolution at warp speed. But it's often taking us where we don't want to go. And so if you look at our great social problems, and again, on my online magazine, there's a series of essays by one of my most valued colleagues, Tony Biglin. That series is titled The Cultural Evolution of Social Pathologies. And so if you look at various social pathologies like the tobacco industry, the arms industry, the food industry, big pharma, the extreme inequality, and you ask why are these terrible things happening, it's because they're being selected for. It's cultural evolution is that's what's happening, and it's happening faster and faster. And so change is evolution. So what we need to do is, can we bend this towards positive change? And the answer is yes, by altering the social environment. That's precisely what we need to do. And it's at that point that technology becomes our friend. There can be no superorganism without a brain, and there can be no brain without the internet. Just like you and I are talking across great distances as if you were by my side. A nervous system needs that. If the nerve impulses travel from your brain to the far reaches of your body, and that's electronic. So we actually have there's a very real sense in which the nervous system was the first internet. That as multicellular organisms got bigger and bigger and bigger, they needed to communicate at a distance. And an electronic communication system evolved. So thinking of the nervous system as the first internet helps us to construct the current internet as a nervous system, but it won't happen spontaneously. This self-organization, the idea that this is just going to happen, absolutely not. It has to be selected.
Yeah, excellent. That's a great analogy for sure. The next question, what does one do with humans who don't function well in otherwise effectively organized groups? I think you answered this one as well.
Well, let me answer it again. I think it's an important thing to go to elaborate on, because it needs to be elaborated on in a compassionate way. And one thing that I've discovered working with many, many groups, it's very easy to frame this in terms of cooperators and cheaters, and to think of the cheaters as somehow selfishly motivated, bad apples and that kind of thing. And of course they exist, but truth be told, in most groups I work with, everyone is well-meaning, and still things don't work well. And when the core design principles are being violated, it's not because somebody's trying to sabotage the group. It's because, for example, they're so passionate about the group that they dominate the conversation, or you get hurt feelings and somebody withdraws and nothing gets done about that. Or there's burnout. People work hard, and so these are things that we could all be compassionate about. And so there, I think that what's needed is this process of flexibility and perspective taking, where you could actually, what that does is it causes a group, just very briefly, in the first place, focus on their valued goals. Why are we in this group? Why is it important to us? What values does it represent to us? And if you do that, then the group comes together right away, because now they're feeling more like a group. That's the first core design principle. The second thing you do is you say, okay, how would we behave to manifest those valued goals? What would we do that would actually, on the basis of those values? And so you list the things that you'd actually do, things that you could see. That's your target of selection. So basically you start out in the head, in the mind, with your goals and your values. And then you go in the world, what you do. Then you go back into your head and you ask the question, isn't it strange that even though this is valuable to us, there's other things in our heads that interfere with this, and that prevent us, that make us go away from our valued goals. And so you explore that part of what's in your mind. That's very important, because if you suppress that, that's going to work. And then how do those things manifest themselves as counterproductive behavior? And then after you then fill out the 4 quadrants of this space, then you put yourself in their crosshairs. That's how you see the world. And it's amazingly effective at enabling you to work around those obstacles. You see, oh, I recognize this. That's an away move. And so now I need to, seeing that and we need to help each other. So this is actually better done in a group than as an individual, because the group reinforces themselves to do that. And so this is what it means to become more flexible, and then to manage the process of cultural evolution to take you where you want it to go. You've aligned the process so that it takes you in the valued directions. And we have many video case reports on the Pro-Social World website. One of the ones I like the best is very mundane. It's a dental office, a dental practice in Germany. And so it's just like every business. I mean, anyone can relate to this. It's just like a dentist and his practice, and he was expanding his practice. He's a gentle, wonderful man. He wants to do well by everyone, but the demands of expanding his practice was actually very stressful for him, and this was somehow rubbing off on his employees. They're just creating problems. No one was having any fun, and things weren't working well. No one was trying to game the system or anything like that. And this process caused that to work better. And so there's some, real exploiters and bullies and individuals that are just trying to take over a group and dominate. They exist. And of course, they need to be excluded, is what, that's the ultimate. And in any religion, I mean, the religions that I study, always there's the exclusion. God. And we hope you'll come back if you repent. They're trying to exclude the behavior, not the person. But the religions I know, they say if somebody just can't behave, then you're out. So that has to be. But for the most part, it's really a matter of well-meaning people understanding their issues and then working together, gaining compassion and love for each other. And then that's, I think, the best answer to the question.
Well, and I really appreciate that answer, because I think everybody who's listening to this, whether they're here live or going to come in later and watch the recording, I mean, I think all of us have had that experience.
Oh, yeah.
Or the other in the groups we've worked in. So I just really appreciate how you answered that. And
I think that it's really an important thing to get across, and thank you for that.
Yeah. And then another question here for you. Since AI is taking center stage, how can it be used to convince people that collaboration and cooperation are more desirable than competition and self-interest? Well, AI, a person who writes intelligently on that is Tim O'Reilly, who is a pioneer of the internet, and has a book cleverly titled WTF ? And that stands for What's the Future and Why It's Up to Us. And he describes AI as something which is like an amazing tool as long as it's used to advance the right thing. And AI is of course, a very rapid evolutionary process. It's a variation and selection process on steroids. And it can be used to do such things. He spends quite a bit of time talking about Amazon as a company which is just brilliant at doing certain things, like getting your packages to you. I love that. I love ordering something the next day the damn thing comes. But on the other hand, I wouldn't want to be an employee. I certainly wouldn't want to be a warehouse employee. I also wouldn't want to be an executive there, because their burnout rate is like tremendous. And they're don't have any kind of enlightened view about the whole earth or anything like that, if only they did. And so if you look at what it does well, then
there's all kinds of things that you can admire, including the use of AI. They work in small teams. That's a good idea. Those teams make promises for what they're going to do, and obviously that has to contribute to the objectives of the company, but it gives them a lot of elbow room. There's core design principle 7. They're called 2 pizza teams because they have to be small enough to be fed on 2 pizzas. And then the AI basically works on that behalf. The whole thing's brilliant if only they change the objectives to have a whole Earth focus. And they could. I mean, they could be talked into it. And they could be also not just talked into it, but also shamed into it. And that's where various forms of social control. The bottom line is, I think that we want these tools, but we need to use them. I mean, another way to put it is that any tool, almost any tool, could also be used as a weapon. And so we don't want to avoid the use of these great tools, but we just want to make sure that they're used as tools and not weapons, or not just monkey wrenches that end up interfering with what we need to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much, David. And thank you for going long.
Sure.
Just taking the extra questions we had. It was a really engaged group on the chat. And just thanks for bringing the hope, because you started with that. So I want to end with that too, and just recognize you for that.
And you can see that I really want to work with everyone out there, and I'm trying to build something which is just large enough to do that, because after all, it is the whole world that needs to change. And so we need to think about doing this in a way that can scale. And so that's what we're working on. But of course, we could use help of all sorts. So thank you for the opportunity.
Absolutely. Thank you, David. And thank you, everyone, for watching tonight. Our next sessions are on Wednesday. That's the 7th with Jamie Metzel at 5 Eastern, then Glenn Martin at 7 Eastern. And we look forward to seeing you then on Building the New World. Thanks so much, everyone. Until then, be well.